Hello, everyone. My name is Evie Lupine. Welcome back. And today we are starting off our Kinkfest interview series. I know we're doing it again this year. It's very, very exciting. And today we are going to be interviewing Sar from the Consent Academy, talking about consent in BDSM and, in particular, complicated consent situations and how to deal with them. So, Sar, just to get started off, would you mind introducing yourself to the audience?
Sure. My name is Sar Surmick. I am the director of the Consent Academy located in Seattle, Washington. I also work as a sex-positive marriage and family therapist.
For those who don't know, what is the Consent Academy and what do they do?
The Consent Academy is an educational collective based out of Seattle, Washington. Our goal, our job, is to teach consent across a wide variety of formats and a wide variety of cultures, so that our major goal really is to help create a consent culture that is robust and well informed, and where people can actually understand both what consent is and how to practice it.
Great. So not just things like consent in BDSM, but consent in the workplace and vanilla relationships, just general how to do consent during life.
Absolutely. We like to say we cover consent from the bedroom to the boardroom.
Gotcha. That's great. All right. So, like I mentioned today, I want to specifically go into consent and BDSM since this is a BDSM channel. But before we get into that specifically, can you just define for people who aren't aware, maybe don't have their own definition yet, what does consent mean?
Consent is a very complicated thing. We like to think about it in terms of, either no means no, or yes means yes. Those are the things that people have normally heard. But I think a broader definition of consent is that consent is the ability for two people to engage in an activity where both people want to be there, have enough information to know what it is they're agreeing to, the capacity to make that agreement, and the ability to say yes or no to it without being coerced or manipulated in their answer.
So I know in the BDSM world, a lot of people have sort of their own ways of talking about what good consent looks like. Like Midori has their own model, and a bunch of other big educators have their own model. So things like informed consent, enthusiastic consent, freely given consent. Are there any of those terms that you think kind of synthesize the idea, or is it maybe a little bit too complex? You just put it in a little phrase like that.
I think all of those terms are great in that, they're trying to get to, they want people to be able to understand consent in the heat of the moment. So simplifying things down is a way to let people do that. We like to talk about it in terms of four basic parts or tenets of consent. The first one being capacity. Do both people have, or two or more people in some cases, have the ability to both give and receive consent as it relates to their physical state, use of substances, emotional state, and power differential. So, that issue of capacity, that's one. Two is informed consent. Does everybody involved have enough information to give an honest answer to the question being asked? Three, we call agreement and boundary setting. So are both people capable and able and willing to give an explicit and or enthusiastic answer to the question, be that yes or no? And four, we call autonomy. Do people have the ability to be their own autonomous person? Do they have the ability to answer questions and give a fully informed response from a place of self where they understand that they have the right to give an answer based on their own needs and wants, instead of giving an answer based on what they think the other person needs and wants. So yeah, so we've started trying to make a mnemonic for that. We call it CIA, Be Your Own Consent Agency. But when we talk about this, and as we started learning how to do it and putting all this together, one of our big things was, consent is really not a simple thing. It has a whole lot of complexity involved in it, and we decided that that's what we wanted to talk to people about. We wanted to talk about that complexity in its amazingness and also in its difficulty.
My experience in the BDSM community and also just in general in life, I do find it is something that people try to simplify down so it's easy to digest, easy to understand, because obviously if people are confused about what consent looks like, that can easily cause some very unpleasant situations, let's say. And at the same time, though, if you are simplifying things down to just enthusiastic consent, informed consent, you are missing those other important elements sometimes that people don't consider, like the element of autonomy, which I'd love to go more into. I think that's a really interesting aspect because I don't recall, at least that I've heard from anybody else that I've talked to consent with, about the autonomy aspect. And I feel like in the context of BDSM, when you're dealing with a submissive, maybe either somebody with a really, really high level of power exchange who is dealing with almost kind of subsuming the self in a way for the sake of high power exchange, or somebody who's really new to BDSM who is really desperate to please others and just wants to find a dom, let's say, although this could be something that happens on either side of the slash or for switches. Sometimes you feel almost like you can't be autonomous and be submissive at the same time because you're supposed to give up yourself and your own desires for the sake of the dominant partner or the top partner if you're doing just a top bottom type of scene. So I guess what I would want to ask is, going down that pathway of talking about the autonomy aspect, how do you balance the need for autonomy and consent with the desire to pursue being, air quotes, truly submissive? Because I think some people might come across like, well, if I'm like retaining all of my autonomy, am I really being submissive?
Right. No, that's a great question. So we think of autonomy as the right for a person to do what they want with or have done to their body, mind, and spirit. So in its base, the issue of autonomy doesn't change the submissive space at all. It just makes sure that the submissive has the choice to be submissive or not. Once they choose to do that, once they choose to engage in that space, that headspace, the behavior, whatever it is for them that makes them submissive or helps them to feel like they're being submissive, they are making that choice, and then anything goes after that as long as it's agreed upon with the other person. So autonomy is not taking away from a person's ability to submit to somebody else. It's actually the basis in which they get to make the choice to submit to somebody else.
It's sort of like you are autonomous up to the point that you decide under which you might give that up for the sake of a scene, but not for the entire time you're doing it. It's almost sort of like there's a play aspect of giving up elements of your choice based on what you negotiate ahead of time with your autonomy to give up.
Exactly. And it's also what allows for the basis of a safe word. So because a person who has their autonomy and retains it by right can say stop at any time, and therefore it's the basis in which the safe word actually works, where the top or the dom respects the bottom or the submissive's autonomy. Then when they safe word, the top or the dom says, oh, okay, they have the right to do that. I'm going to stop doing what we're doing.
Thanks for explaining that. I think that makes a lot of sense. And if anybody who's listening to this still has questions, feel free to leave it in the comments and we can continue this conversation. But that's something that I know I've talked about before in my videos where I've gone over things like negotiation, and in other conversations, regardless of what side of the slash you're on, you don't walk into the situation with no rights. That's not the idea behind BDSM. You negotiate for the times when you would give that up. And even during a scene, because you usually need to have things like safe words in place. Some people play without them, but that's more of an advanced topic and not necessarily something I'd recommend that everybody do. You need to keep some level of autonomy in there so you can always get yourself out of a situation and feel like you have the right to, if nothing else. So what I'd like to discuss next is kind of going along the same lines as negotiation. When you have those key points in mind, how do you go into negotiating with somebody while keeping these consent aspects in mind? What would a good negotiation look like, basically?
I think it starts with that first piece of capacity. One of the things that we found where people get themselves into trouble around consent the most is they go into a negotiation already in a diminished or impaired state. So that could be because they've been drinking, or they've taken some other mind-altering substance, or they're just really scared or really nervous or really horny, or like their emotions are all up and they're really aroused. And what happens in that place is they've diminished their capacity to engage in consensual behavior. They haven't taken it away entirely, right? They haven't removed it, but they've diminished it. And when you diminish your capacity, you increase your risk of consent violation happening. One of the big pieces about negotiation that we like to talk about is doing it from a place where both people can be in a stable and centered headspace and physical space, so that when they're negotiating from a clear mind and can actually talk about what they want for themselves. So that's the first part. The second thing a good negotiation really looks like is where both people are being honest and open. So we make a distinction between those two things where honesty is being truthful. Somebody asks you a question and you say, do you like to do rope? And you say, honestly, yes, I like to do rope. Open is about being forthcoming with information. So, what do you like to do? I like to do rope. And therefore, you're in that space where both people are freely giving information and giving good and accurate information to the other person. So a good negotiation kind of requires both of those pieces.
What would you recommend for people who go into negotiations or want to do BDSM but do find themselves in the place where they're really nervous or they have trouble being open with their partners?
The best thing to do that I found both personally and professionally is take the negotiation out of the space where you're going to play. Negotiate at a coffee shop or go for a walk and negotiate while you're on the walk. Take it out of the place where the play happens, where possible. Some people also do this online. They do it by text or they do it by email. And therefore, you're not in the same heightened space, and you can think about it in a much more clear way. Do I really want that? Do I not really want that? So that's one piece. And the other piece is to do the work ahead of time. Fantasize. What do you want? What sounds good? What is hot for you? And then practice with yourself. Like, imagine negotiating with yourself. What would I say if somebody asked me this? What would I say if somebody asked me that? But that internal work and that internal practice gives you a lot more confidence when you go into talking to somebody else and they're like, oh, I want ABC. And then a lot of times the person's brain, especially if they're new, just kind of freezes and goes, is that what I want? I don't know.
Sometimes the reality of it can be very different from the fantasy of it, or doing something with a specific person can be very different. Like maybe you really, really want to do a flogging with somebody and maybe the person you're negotiating with isn't feeling like the person you want to do a flogging with. And it's just very important to be in tune with your own sort of gut feelings, I'd say, when you're doing negotiations, so that way you can make sure you're sort of staying true to yourself, basically, is maybe how I would summarize it. What do you want to do regardless of maybe what you're perceiving as the other person's wants are.
Absolutely.
One thing that I am thinking about here is pickup play. Obviously, it's not something that everybody does, but I know a lot of people do enjoy doing spontaneous play. They like going to a dungeon, particularly when it is a night that's themed around like a mixer or something where you're intended to go and find somebody and then go and play. Are there any precautions that somebody could take going into that situation, knowing that they might be getting into a pickup play situation with somebody they don't otherwise know, to make sure that they are still practicing good consent and good negotiation practices?
The best thing people can do in that situation is use what we call inclusive consent. So that place of, what do you want to do? And the answer is, here are 5 things I want to do. Then the consent is only given for those 5, and ideally 5 very specific activities, right? I want to engage in rope, but only tied above the waist. I want to engage in oral sex, me giving oral sex. I want to engage in heavy petting, and I'm okay with some flogging, but only on the back. Right? 4 things. That's inclusive consent. That's all I consent to. And then the person receiving that, says to themselves, okay, how do I keep this situation consensual and safe? I only do those 4 things, and I don't try to push the boundary on those 4 things. And so both people are in a place of, okay, we know what's been agreed to. It's a very short list. Then that's all you do. That's all you go. I also know people who like to do that in the space of, okay, I wheel my toy bag in, and you get to pick 4 toys, and that's it, right? Those are the only toys we're playing with.
Yeah, and then hopefully also maybe like, and where can I use this toy on you? Because using a flogger on the breast is very different than, for some people anyways, than using it on the back.
Yeah, and ideally each one of those is negotiated. And if it's not, if for some people they don't like to be that specific, or they're feeling a lot of internalized pressure or shame, so they can't get the words out. In that case, it's going slow and doing things in a very methodical way, starting with the safest spaces, the safest areas, checking in each time to see if more is wanted.
Also, something I want to talk about is make sure that we're talking about consent from the top side specifically. How do you, as a top or a dominant, make sure you are keeping these consent elements in mind, and like what sort of questions might you want to ask as the top in a negotiation to make sure you're getting all the information you need to have a consensual situation?
Sure. Well, the first thing I would like to say is that as the top, you get to give consent definitely as well. And so I've seen a number of situations where, a submissive or a bottom comes in. It's like, oh, I want, you do this thing, and I really want to do this thing, and da 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 da. And then the top starts to feel like they have to, if they're known for doing rope, or they're known for doing flogging, or, all these things, that there's this pressure to do that, even if they don't want to do that. And so I think the first piece is for tops to remember that they need to give consent as well. The second piece is in terms of questions to ask. I think the best one is there anything else I need to know? Go through your list of questions, what you want to do, what you have planned, da 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 da, all those things. Get consent for the basics, and then add at the end, is there anything else I need to know? So even if you've already talked about, what type of sex you're going to have, what type of sexual contact you're going to have, what activities you're going to engage in, are there any STI risks? I like to ask, are there any emotional risks that I need to know about? Because people come into things with traumas, or they come into things with bad past experiences. And so I really like to know what those are, if I'm going to, be edging up on something that might trigger that. But even after all that, I think it's like, okay, given the scene we've negotiated, did I miss anything? Not spending time in that place where, tops are not infallible, right? We can make mistakes, and therefore being able to just say, I might have missed something. I might have forgot something. Is there something else I need to know? And then really encouraging the other person to think about it. Don't just add, oh no, you're good. I'm like, no. Take 20 or 30 seconds and really think about it.
A lot of times new people don't, it's kind of like a they don't know what they don't know sort of situation where they don't know necessarily what they need to disclose. Like people who've never done rope before don't realize they should disclose that they have an asthma inhaler, or people who want to do a 2-hour long bondage scene with a gag don't disclose that they have diabetes and might need something to help their blood sugar. Those sorts of things where maybe they don't necessarily as a bottom think right away, this is something I need to tell my top that might come up.
And I think as a top, one of the best things you can do is like understand what you're doing, but then go through it and be in this place of, okay, what questions should have been asked? What information would go along? If I'm doing a 2-hour rope scene, has the other person told me about joint issues? Depending on their age, but you don't get to a certain age without having some of them. And so, have they mentioned this? Have they talked about the last time they ate? Have they talked about how much sleep they've gotten? Have they talked about any emotional issues or things that might pertain to this? So I'm looking for, are there any holes in the information that I care about?
I think negotiation and consent, obviously, they're very complicated issues. And I think in general, what I would want people to take away from this is it's really about trying your best, but it's very rare that you will do it every single time absolutely perfectly and remember to say everything that you need to before a scene starts, which is really important, that you have something in scene where you can communicate in an ongoing way somehow, if possible, if something that you weren't expecting comes up, or something that maybe you were expecting but forgot to mention at the time comes up.
Yeah, that ability to check in, especially if you're doing pickup play, but even if you're playing with somebody you're familiar with or know, that ability for either person to call yellow and do a check-in, or to work out some sort of system if you're doing a role play where information can be passed back and forth without breaking character.
I mean, we could go into a whole conversation about safe words if you wanted to, but I mean, things like having nonverbal safe words, having some sort of method to communicate, because there are situations where just, yelling, hey, stop in a scene maybe won't actually cause the scene to stop, or maybe you can't because you have a gag in your mouth or you're spinning upside down by one ankle. And you need to, negotiate for a way to communicate that makes sense for the scene that you're doing, basically, is I guess what I would say really quickly.
Oh yeah, definitely. The scene you're doing and the people you're with. Let's imagine, for example, you're playing with somebody who's deaf, right? You need a visual way to communicate that's going to be able to work with them in that space.
Do you have any checklists that you recommend that you think are helpful, or yes, no, maybe lists? Do you think those are something that are good to use, or are they limiting? What's your opinion about those?
I like a really robust, I call them want, will, won't lists, but something, I think those are great ways to open the conversation, because again, like you said before, there are things you don't know that you don't know. And so working with somebody else who's put together a list of 100, 200, 300 different activities gives you an opportunity to go, oh, I never considered doing that. That could be interesting, or I'd never want to touch that thing ever. And I think so those are great for opening the conversation, but I think they're the opening of the conversation, not the whole negotiation itself.
So I think hopefully now everybody kind of has a little bit of an understanding of the basics of consent framework. Let's say what it is, how you negotiate for it, how you use it in scene. So what I'd like to spend hopefully the rest of our conversation talking about is sort of the sticky consent situations that we get into in BDSM. Like, how do you handle consent in a long-term high power exchange relationship? How do you handle things when consent is violated? How do you handle things where you're doing consensual non-consent? So I think maybe the best place to start this conversation is, moving away from just negotiating and using consent on a scene by scene basis. How does that change, or if it does, when you're getting into long-term BDSM relationships like a 24/7 or a regularly occurring power exchange dynamic?
We'll start with the one first, which is, so you're with somebody, you've played with them for a long time, you've built up a good consent framework. You know what they like, you know what they don't like, what level of power exchange can be in play, and so that that's in that place of, hey, the consent can be as simple of, the usual Tuesday, and they're like, yeah, the usual Tuesday. And they're like, that there's your negotiation. As long as there's still the ability for either person to withdraw consent. So that's what keeps that situation consensual, is that either person can say, I thought this was a good idea, but wow, is my ankle acting up? I need to stop. Or I thought this was a great idea, but I'm just really exhausted. I can't keep going. We either need to wrap this up or try something else.
So still sort of relying on plain English communication for things like, I'm having a medical issue, I'm about to faint because I haven't had any water to drink today type of stuff? Or is that maybe a situation where you would still maybe use a safe word, but then once you've said yellow, you would bring up that specifically? Or does that sort of depend?
I mean, it depends on how you're playing. If you're not doing, if you're in a role play situation, the safe word is a really nice way to do, to kick out of the headspace of the character. If you're doing like an elaborate rope tie or bondage where you're not in a role play situation, stop could be just stop. But I think if you know the person, you'll have an idea of what works best for them, both in hearing and in giving. So that's that familiarity piece, which allows us to push boundaries a little bit and get into more deeper BDSM play when we have a good handle on the person, who they are.
So how do you handle things then when you're getting into not only an ongoing type power dynamic where you've played with somebody a lot, but you're getting into, so-called total power exchange relationships where a lot of people say that they have no limits or they don't use safe words anymore? What would you advise for somebody who wants to pursue that to make sure they can maybe, I don't know, maintain that fantasy element of not air quotes, not having any limits, or feeling like they don't have any limits, but still maintaining that ultimate ability to leave the situation so it maintains consensuality?
Right, and that's a hard one, because in a lot of places that DS, MS, dominant submissive, master slave dynamic is a really complicated part of consent. I think consent can still exist in that space, but it is the place of one person giving it up, right? Giving it over to the other person. So I think to do it well, to make sure that it is still in a clear and consensual space, starts from the beginning. It's what is the negotiation? What is the framework in which these two people are entering into a long-term DS or MS space? All of that is worked out up front. Does the person have carte blanche, right? Do they have the ability to tell the person to do anything? Or is it they have the right to do that when the person is in the home, but they don't have the right to tell them what to do at work? Like all of these things are what get into that complexity. So I think that's the starting point. Really defining the space and defining where the power exchange is happening. And then the second point is going back to that issue of autonomy. No matter what, the person who is given over power still retains their autonomy. They can give it up in behavior, they can give it up in practice, but it is never removed from them in any full way. And so, if nothing else, we've entered into this relationship defined by these terms. If nothing else, the person can say, okay, this relationship is over. Well, no, and then so that is the sort of the final piece of, I no longer agree to this negotiation, even if that negotiation has been fully in place for 6 months. Right? I no longer agree to this negotiation. I no longer consent to this activity. I take back my right to make choices for myself.
I think that all makes a lot of sense, and sort of maybe the way I would summarize it for people is you always need to have the fire exit, basically. You need to have an emergency exit, and obviously having to use if this happens, we're going to break up, having almost sort of an ultimatum isn't the ideal way to do a total power exchange relationship. But if you are going to do it where you've removed those other tools that are more commonly used, like safe words and boundaries and limits and things like that, that's sort of kind of what you're left with. And I think it's just knowing that going into it is you either need to really, really be able to trust your partner to, even if you are in a total power exchange relationship, to hear you in plain English when something goes wrong, enough to make the decision, even with their own ultimate authority, to stop when it would be, too harmful, I guess, let's say, to the relationship if they did otherwise. But yeah, it's really complicated. Another thing is very individual too. And there's so many different ways of doing total power exchange relationships. And for anybody who's listening to this and is curious about this lifestyle and wants to do it well, I think the best way to go into it is to practice first. Like, practice doing, normal BDSM, like having just one scene, no power exchange type situations before you really go into these waters, simply because there are so many more complex issues that happen when you are dealing with, I guess, modified consent frameworks in terms of what options are available to you for negotiating those things. The next thing I want to talk about is kind of along the same lines, and that is consensual non-consent, or CNC play. I know a lot of people also refer to this as rape play or ravishment play. I personally prefer the term CNC because I think it's more inclusive and has, let's say, less triggering language in it, while sort of getting the same idea across. But a lot of people who are interested in power exchange, and particularly high levels of power exchange, are also interested in doing consensual non-consent play. It's probably one of the top fantasies that most submissives I know have. So if that was something that was interesting to you, how would you go about finding a partner for that and starting that negotiation framework for a consensual non-consent situation?
Yeah, and this is a question I get asked a lot, and I don't think it's a lot different than any other consensual situation, in that both parties have to agree to what's going to happen going in. I think where people get into a lot of trouble is they just say, "Oh, I want to do a CNC, or I want to do rape play, or I want to do something of that nature," and expect that the other person knows what they mean by that. And so anytime you're dealing with fantasy, you have to define what the fantasy is. So you can ask the other person, does that work for you? Or what might need to change so that it will work for you? And then, the consent is given ahead of time, right? You work out the details, you give consent, and then you engage in a scene that to the outside would look like non-consensual behavior. But from the inside is still in a consensual space. I think it's what allows us the safety to engage in these types of things, that we can play with them rather than experiencing them as trauma. And so having that experience of, I consented to this, you consented to this, right? Now we can actually do this in a way that is still safe or safe enough. Because it's not always totally safe, but it's at least safe enough. And then, of course, having that safe word or that ability to end the scene if the situation, the emotions or the dynamic just starts to go in a direction that is no longer comfortable. But so I think if you have that consent at the beginning, and then you have a way to get out of it, that's what allows CNC to remain.
It's almost like you make sort of a consent sandwich where you're like consent at the beginning, a little non-consent at the end, and then a consensual way to leave. Is there anything about that would change if you were doing consensual non-consent as an ongoing part of the relationship as opposed to a scene-by-scene basis? Or is it basically just you're sort of like, to continue the sandwich analogy, because I haven't eaten yet today, to like almost make like a club sandwich where you're layering sort of the elements of consent and non-consent just over time on top of each other?
Yeah, I think that's exactly it. And I think the other piece that is important in that sandwich is that you reconfirm consent at the end, right? So you went through, you did this thing, it was really intense. You just check, you have that check-in as part of the aftercare to go, just want you to know, I was still totally on board with this. And I want to make sure you were still totally on board with this too. So you're getting that nice, we did it at the beginning, we made sure there was the ability to get out of it in the middle, and then we're reconfirming consent at the end. And if there were any problems, right, then that's a place where we can deal with them.
For tops who play on CNC type scenes, a lot of times, submissives are usually maybe the ones who fantasize this in a more open way because it's a little bit safer, I guess, to want to play out the victim role. Like mentally, it's easier to like empathize with yourself when you're visualizing yourself as the victim in those situations. But when you're the top and you're the one who is, so-called like victimizing somebody else in a scene, I think it's really important to not only check in with the submissive, but also encourage the submissive to check in with you. Because I know from past experiences I've had and with stories I've heard from the top side, it can be really damaging to feel like you're the bad guy, to feel like you did something wrong and not have that confirmation from your partner that what you actually did was okay. So yeah, check in with your tops and your doms too, everybody. It's, aftercare and checking in is not just for bottoms and submissives. Going along these same lines, talking about, consensual non-consent and checking in. Is it something where you think you should do it right away after the scene? Or if you're doing something where maybe there's like a really heavy role play element and maybe somebody isn't ready to like verbally engage with the person right after a scene, are there any methods you recommend for contacting people after a scene has happened to check in while still kind of maintaining the space that maybe somebody needs after a scene to kind of feel like themselves again?
It's entirely variable. I think part of that needs to enter into the negotiation ahead of time. The more intense a scene that I'm doing, the more intense, emotional or physical impact it's going to have. I know that the person is going to need more time to come down out of that space. So being able to negotiate ahead of time and be like, okay, what is the best way for me to contact you? Because some people want to do it right away. And some people are like, I need to sleep, or I need food first, or I need, cuddles and love first, whatever it is. And so being able to find that out and then just be able to say, oh, okay, like, then that's what we'll do. I know for myself personally, I like feedback like right away. Like I want to know 30 seconds after the scene ended, how was that? What did I do right? What was good? What was not? But for a lot of people, that's too soon. They need time to think about it. They need time to process. And just from a physiological standpoint, for something that's really intense, the adrenaline and the other hormones and neurotransmitters that get produced can take 40 to 60 minutes to just work their way out of the body, so that just from a physiological standpoint, the person may need an hour to come down. So I think that's just part of negotiating what aftercare looks like.
We're coming a little bit close on time, but there's two big things that I wanted to still ask you about. And one is negotiating with impaired circumstances. So things like, if somebody wants to do a scene, particularly with CNC, that involves things like drug use or drinking beforehand, or negotiating mid-scene when somebody's in subspace. And the other thing that I wanted to make sure that we touched on is accountability and having a way maybe to check in without directly doing so with the person. And in particular, my experience with this has been in talking about CNC, having like a third party that you can go to and talk about your situations and your experiences with, that is not the person you played with, sort of almost like having a sounding board in terms of like, hey, how does this sound to you? Is this something that I should be worried about, type of thing? Just almost sort of having a confidant that you can go to talk about situations. So I guess let's first talk about playing in impaired circumstances, because obviously that is something that some people want to do. And in particular, in my experiences that I've had when I've been in Europe and when my partner's been in Europe, is play and drugs and alcohol go together a lot more than they do in the United States. Not necessarily a good thing, not necessarily a bad thing. It's up to, your own or personal choices there. But if somebody did want to have a scene where they had engaged in some sort of mind altering substance, let's say beforehand, is that something where maybe you could negotiate before you had like consumed those substances for the scene where that was going to happen? Or is that maybe still a gray area to be aware of, especially when it comes to, let's say, consent being revoked mid-scene?
I think if you are going to include substances, any mind-altering substance at all, as much as possible, doing the negotiation while still being clear-headed is really important, so that you're not in an impaired state while negotiating to be in an impaired state. But the other thing to remember is that if you're going to engage in that situation, you understand ahead of time that your risk has increased. Right? Your risk of a consent violation, your risk of an injury, all go up. Depending on how impaired you are, they could go up pretty dramatically. And in which case, you're going into the situation knowing that could happen, and thus you can take responsibility if it does. And so it's like, I negotiated to play the scene drunk. Something bad happened. Okay. It's kind of like if you get behind the wheel of a car and something happens while you're drunk, you got behind the wheel of the car. And especially that you're choosing to engage in it while in an impaired state where consent really is absent in that moment. That doesn't mean you couldn't get it ahead of time, but know that a person who is in a highly inebriated or impaired state is not capable of giving consent. And therefore, if afterwards they feel like their consent was violated, then you have to be able to talk about, okay, this is what we negotiated for ahead of time. I see how you're feeling now. Let's talk about how you're feeling, what could have been done differently, and how we can repair this situation.
What happens when consent changes mid-scene? Either somebody said no to something during negotiation but is saying yes now, like they're asking for something that they negotiated not to do, or the other way where they no longer want to do something that they said they wanted to do. How do you handle those situations? And especially for a top, how do you recommend doing that when a submissive has that sort of reaction during a scene?
Yeah, well, from the top's perspective, if something's been negotiated and the person is now saying, no, I don't want to do that, that's it. I think from the top's perspective, if you negotiate with somebody and they said, I don't want to do this thing, we'll take intercourse as an example. Like to say, I don't want to do intercourse during the scene, and you get mid-scene and they're saying, like, no, I really want you inside me. I really want to be inside you, whatever it is. I think the answer to that from the top's perspective is we didn't negotiate for that. I'm going to hold the boundary as we discussed. And then if after the scene you want to do a second scene, or if you want to do a scene again next week and include that, I'm all in. So you hold the negotiation as the boundary, because when being in subspace, being in top space, just being really aroused and horny is an altered state of consciousness.
That is sort of how I would recommend people default and play, is like, if you have not negotiated for something, wait until another time when you can do this again, where you can negotiate for it. Because I think sometimes, especially when people are new or they're playing with a new person, it feels like this is your only opportunity you're ever going to have. This is the only time the moment is right for this particular activity, when in reality, barring extreme circumstance, you are going to have more time to play with this person again if you really enjoyed it, and you're going to have more time for more scenes. And just, I would encourage people to keep that in mind, because I think it is so easy to fall into that trap of like, I need to do everything right now and try it all. And if I don't experience it now, I'm never going to. Like, once you've gotten into BDSM, there are so many things to explore. It'd probably be impossible to do it all, even in an entire lifetime. So, just remember to slow down. And for the things that you do really want to do, you can make time for it later.
Yeah, there's always tomorrow. Or maybe next week if you can't get to it tomorrow. It's getting out of that idea of scarcity, getting like, oh, I have to have this right now. That idea, I think, gets people in a lot of trouble.
So the last thing I want to make sure that we touch on today is, again, accountability, and in particular, how to handle things when you have experienced a consent injury or a consent issue. Either somebody has done something to you they're not comfortable with, or when somebody comes to you and says that you've done something to them that makes them uncomfortable. How do you recommend approaching that situation?
That's a great question, and we could probably easily spend 2 hours on it. The base answer is, if you feel like someone has violated your consent, you're the person who gets to make that determination. Nobody else gets to make it for you. Nobody else gets to tell you you're wrong. If that's how you feel, then that's what's happened. And you have to then deal with that situation as though it is real, because it is real to you. How you go about that is going to depend on the circumstance. If you are in a club or an organization, or you're at an event that somebody is hosting, they should have procedure for what to do if your consent is violated in their space. If they don't, ask them to make one. And then you can follow that and get support from the people who are hosting that event. If it is personal, like if you're just one-on-one with somebody, where you feel safe to do so, tell them, say, hey, this is a thing that happened. This is how I'm feeling. I want to get your perspective, and I want to work this out. Assuming you do want to work it out. If you don't want to work it out, then that's fine. Don't ever play with that person again, and you'll be okay. And then the last piece is to get the emotional support necessary to deal with it. Consent violations have a wide range. People tend to think of them as just the really high traumatic end, but they can be really small. They can be, I told you not to touch my ear, and you touched my ear, and I didn't want that, but you did it anyway. I'm feeling bad that you did it, but I'm not feeling emotionally traumatized that you did it. All the way up on to the other end of the scale where, I'm feeling significantly emotionally traumatized. Either way, get support. That could be talking to a friend, or somebody who you can, just share your feelings and thoughts with, or it could be seeking therapy for either the event that happened, or if what happened has triggered some past trauma or event that has brought up, that's been brought to the surface, and that's what therapy and support is for. It's to deal with those deeper wounds and those deeper issues, which BDSM can bring up for people fairly regularly. when you play on the edge, you're going to find the edge cases. When you experience that, when you experience your consent being violated, understand that it's a real thing. It has real impact, and it needs to be dealt with the same way any other significant emotional situation needs to be dealt with. And how that works for you is going to be individual to you. On the other side, if someone comes to you and says, "Hey, you violated my consent," the first thing to do, the first important thing to do, is to be quiet and manage your own feelings. Because when someone comes to you and says, "Hey, you hurt me," our initial human reaction is usually to get defensive. No, I didn't. I didn't mean to do that. I hadn't gone out of my way to hurt you. But that's actually the totally wrong reaction to take. The best thing you can do is to say to the other person, "I'm so sorry. Tell me how it is that I hurt you." And then listen. It's the step that I think people miss most often, is that they don't actually take the time to listen to what the other person is saying.
I would encourage people to remember to practice empathy without putting their own feelings in front of that. You can sympathize with somebody and acknowledge their experience without necessarily immediately having to address your own at the same time.
And it is important then to afterwards, like after you've listened to the person, to offer amends, like to offer to find it again. It's how do we repair this? Think of it as I have a relationship with this person, even if I've just been with them once. I still have a relationship with them. How do I heal that relationship? And then go and get support yourself. It is a really hard thing for a person who is in a space of, I want this to be good. I want to have a good time. I want this other person to have a good time, to hear, "Oh my God, I've hurt them." That's a hard thing to process. It's an emotional thing, and therefore it needs support too. I will add one final note. We're talking about the unintentional harm. We're talking about a person who has made a mistake, or there was an oops, or something happened that was not meant. This is not the same procedure for someone who has experienced intentional harm, where a person has gone out of their way to violate someone else's consent. That type of behavior is harmful not only to the person, but to the community as a whole. And so people who engage in that behavior need to be dealt with in a much more higher level way. I deal with support from the larger community and people who have power and authority to start to create change. But those are two different situations. The apology, the restitution, the making amends, the taking of responsibility is something to do when harm was unintentional. Where someone is intentionally out there violating consent over and over and over again, either because they're unable to do differently due to some personal or mental health issue, or because they are choosing to do that intentionally. Either way, that's a person who needs to be, dealt with on something more than just a personal level.
This does bring up one more issue that I've been thinking about a lot, just in personally, and something that I've been talking a lot with people in my local community about is the missing stare problem, where you have known people, to some anyways, in the community who do have these ongoing, typically malicious or purposeful consent violations, but because of the structures we have in place that make it difficult to name names outright to anybody who comes into the scene, new people are not always aware of who the dangerous or the people who are going out and purposely violating consent are. Do you have any tools maybe that you could offer to new people to avoid this issue, or just for maybe people who are in the community in general, how maybe we can start working to resolve this issue that we have?
Well, I think the problem with the missing stare person is sometimes that's an intentional predator, and sometimes it's just someone who never got the education to know better. And everybody just like, oh, that's so and so.
Yeah, that's another thing too, is the missing stare is not always a bad player in a malicious sense, but maybe somebody who like, well, they say that they do rope, and if you're new, you might not know enough to ask the right questions to determine their skill level, but actually, they use floss as their primary like tool for bondage, and that's generally not recommended. So you make your own choices.
Yeah, so I think the way to go about it from a new person's perspective is to engage in community. Find the groups that are local, find the people who've been doing it for a while, and just ask questions like who's good to play with and who's not. I think from a community perspective, on a more procedural level, I think we are in the process of trying to figure out, okay, how do we call out people who have been problems, who have been hurting the community, and either get them the help they need to do better, because that's ideally what we want, is to get people the tools they need to be good players, or if that's not possible, how to make sure people know not to play with them. I don't know what the answer is going to end up being. I think we'll probably figure it out over the next 2 to 3 years. I imagine it'll probably be some form of if not external list, at least an internal list. We're always going to have that difficulty, but I think as we start creating appropriate policy and appropriate procedure as organizational groups, as orgs that put on events and do things, then we'll start to be in a place of, okay, if something happens to you and you can't resolve it personally, here's people who can help you resolve it, and that'll start putting the names into a centralized place where people can ask questions and get the tools they need to play safe, because that's what we want.
Yeah. So, I mean, there's a million other questions that we could go into, but we are already running out of time here. So what I'd like to leave people with, is there any other places where people can reach out to you or find more resources related to these issues?
Absolutely. So you can reach us at www.consent.academy. That's our website. There's a contact page. If you have questions, you can reach out to us through that contact page. We host regular events. We have a free monthly consent workshop here in Seattle that we offer to the community. You can find that location and information on the website. We run workshops. In March, we have an event called Consent Fest. In May, we're doing a consent educator retreat. So if you're a person who teaches in the BDSM community or who teaches in the vanilla world and wants to know more about how to teach consent, that's coming up in May. And beyond that, we are hopefully in March going to be releasing a book called The Consent Primer, which will be kind of we're hoping it to be one of the first works of its kind where we actually start delving into some of this complexity around what consent is and how it works and what it means.
That sounds great. All right. Yeah. If people are interested in that, I'm sure when it comes out, we will be doing a book club episode about it. So people who are followers of this channel, if you're listening to this in the future, be on the lookout for that. And thank you so much for being with us today and sharing all your insight and knowledge. I know I personally have learned a lot and basically have a lot of new ideas about consent. If people do have any questions, feel free to either, go out to the resources that I have shown on the screen right now, or you can always leave a comment here in the comment section on YouTube, and I can also help you out if you need anything. And yeah, thanks again so much for being here. And you will be at Kinkfest teaching as well, right?
Yep, we will be at Kinkfest. We have a number of classes we're teaching. It'll be me and 3 of my other educators. So we're planning to have a really great time.
If you want to learn more about good consent practices, about BDSM, about all that fun stuff, be sure to check it out. And I will talk to you all again very soon. Have a great day. Bye-bye.